சுரபிமகவின எழுபொருள் வினவிட மனுவின் நெறிமணி அசைவுற விசைமிகு துயரில் செவியினில் அடிபட வினவுமின் அதிதீது. சுரபிமகவின எழுபொருள் வினவிட மனுவின் நெறிமணி அசைவுற விசைமிகு துயரில் செவியினில் அடிபட வினவுமின் அதிதீது. துணிவில் இது பிழை பெரிதென வரும் மனு உருகியரகர சிவ சிவ பெருமதோ சுரபி அலமர விழி புனல் பெருகிட நடுவாக. துணிவில் இது பிழை பெரிதென வரும் மனு உருகியரகர சிவ சிவ பெருமதோ சுரபி அலமர விழி புனல் பெருகிட நடுவாக. பரவியதனது துயர் கொடு நடவிய பழுதின் மதலையை உடல் ஒரு பிளவோடு படியரதம் அதை நடவிட மொழிபவன் அருளாரூர். பரவியதனது துயர் கொடு நடவிய பழுதின் மதலையை உடலிரு பிளவோடு படியரதம் அதை நடவிட மொழிபவன் அருளாரூர் அருளாரூர். These are just 3 verses from one of the Tirupugars written by Geethaanubhava, and it might just sound like a treat to the ears to listen to the racing words and their perfect meter, but in fact, in these sweet words, Geethaanubhava has embedded the entire story that I'm about to narrate, which will take me at least 7 to 8 minutes to narrate. He has just encapsulated in these 3 verses. And the story I'm talking about is that of Manunidi Soran, which will be the first of the 2 glorious tales that we listen to today. As I said last week, in this final episode of this Thyagesa series, we'll be looking into some of the Sivan-Adiyaargal or the Bhaktas who availed the grace of Thyagesa Peruman in Thiruvarur. And though there are numerous such Bhaktas, as Sekira Peruman himself says in the Periya Puranam, he says, Araneriyil Yennirandorku Arul Purindu. Thyagesa is the Lord who blessed innumerable devotees who followed the righteous path of Shiva. So, among these many devotees, we'll be looking into just 2 of them. The first being Manunidi Soran, a just, righteous and royal king. And the second is Dandi Adigal, who was a simple, blind and brave rebel. So, coming to the first tale, before I begin, I need to pay my respects to Sekira Peruman, who is the author of the Periya Puranam, which forms the 12th volume or the 12th Tirumarai, which is among the most sacred Tamil texts on Shaivism. In this, he narrates the story of the 63 Nayan Margal or the mystic Shaivite saints, who we revere as the foremost devotees of Lord Shiva. And it is even called the Tirutondar Puranam because it narrates the tales of the Tirutondar or the respectable devotees or bhaktas of Lord Shiva. And though the first tale that we're looking into, that of Manunidi Soran, is not featured among the 63 Nayanmars, he occupies a very special position because when Sekira Peruman begins this book, this Periya Puranam, he talks about the glory of one mountain, one river, one city and so on. And when he has to choose one specific city among the Sora kingdom to talk about, he doesn't pick the capital of Shaivism as we call it, which is Chidambaram or Gangaikonda Sorapuram or any of these places. He picks Thiruvarur. We already saw this in the first opening introduction episode of the series. But what is more is that when he talks about Thiruvarur, there are so many countless bhaktas who have gained the grace of Thyagesa Peruman here, but specifically he mentions the tale of Manunidi Soran in much detail because he is said to be the one of the foremost devotees who added glory to this Thiruvarur Kshetram. So his story goes like this. Manunidi Soran was a very righteous king, and Sekira Peruman says, Senkadiron Vadithondrinan. He was born in the golden solar race, and he was called Manunidi Soran because he first of all came in the lineage of Manu. Manu is known to be the first person to have established the code of civilization as we know it today. The whole mankind, as we call it in Tamil or Sanskrit, is called Manushya Jati, and that is named after the king Manu. And his descendants are some of the most righteous and worshipped, celebrated rulers in history. For example, Manu's child was Ikshvaku, and in his lineage was Dasharatha and Ramachandra Prabhu. All of them came, and in the same lineage this king has also come, and he is known for sticking to the Manu Nidhi, or the law of Manu, to the T, which is why he was given the name Manu Nidhi Soran. And he was known for this, and he governs a very righteous, very lawful kingdom, and he is blessed with a very righteous and very talented son, and he wants to make him the prince of the kingdom, and he is the apple of the king's eye. And so Sekiyar Peruman also describes his son in many verses, but the most concise description of him is Valar Ilam Paridi. He is born in the solar race, so he is also a sun, but he's like, if his father, the king, is like a bright glowing sun, this is like a young sun growing to be just as bright. Valar Ilam Paridi. So this prince grows up in this same Tiruvarur, where his father is ruling, as keeping Tiruvarur as the capital. And one day he happens to be going along the streets of Tiruvarur on his chariot, and the prince happens to be riding the chariot, and it so happens that a young calf, a child cow, happens to be crossing the street. It doesn't see the chariot and runs forth and gets stuck between the wheels of the chariot. Unfortunately, it breathes its last at that very moment, and more than the cow, the prince is horrified. The mother cow is also standing by, who is weeping in agony at having lost its child, but the prince is equally worried. He says, and the beauty of it is, he's not worried about himself. He knows that if he has committed a sin, he will suffer the karma for it. But even more than that, Sekiyar Peruman says, Ulagankakkum manuvenum en komanukku ulagil ippari vandu eida pirandava oruvan. He's talking about his ancestor Manu as well as his father Manu Nidhi Soran, and says that to he who has protected the world with his Manu Nidhi, I have been unfortunately born as a cursed child to involve him in such a heinous sin. And this seems to be the regard that children of this solar race have for their father. They seem to value their father's esteem more than their own life. For example, even in the Ramayanam, I told you that Ramachandra Murthy was in the same kulam. He is also, as we saw, respecting his father's wishes more than his own. So he's not fazed when he is sent out of the kingdom, and he just wants to uphold his father's word. And when he shoots Vali in the forest to help Sugriva, Vali says something very interesting. He says, Manuneri Kuritrundo, has your Manu's code of conduct told you to kill a monkey on the way to avenge the abduction of your wife Sita? And we won't go into that story, but it's just interesting to note that Rama also followed the same path, following the Manu Nidhi, and valued his father's word above himself, and his descendants are sure to take after him. So this prince is also shattered that an ill name may befall his father, the protector of Manu Nidhi. And when he's wondering how to make up for this, the cow immediately runs to the court of the king, Manu Nidhi Soran, and apparently there was a bell hung there called the justice bell, which had to be rung if any person of any living creature in the city of Tiruvarur or in his empire wanted an audience with the king to demand justice. At this point, we need to marvel at the poetic beauty of Sekiyar Peruman, the poetic prowess he has. He describes the sound of the bell that approaches Manu Nidhi Soran's ear. He says, Paripparai Murakko. Was it the sound of reproach that rang in the bell? Or Arkum Pavatin Volio, or the ringing of his past sins? Or finally he says something even more beautiful. He says, Vendan Vari Thirumaindan Avi Kola Varum Marali Urdi Karuttani Maniyin Arpo. Yama is arriving on a buffalo to snatch the life of the king's only son. Is it perhaps the tinkling of the bells worn around the neck of Yama's buffalo? This is the way he describes the sound of the bell. And as soon as the king hears the sound, he immediately senses something is wrong and comes rushing out of the court himself. And he sees this cow with tears rolling down its eyes standing before the king. And he asks his ministers immediately what has happened, and the news is spread like wildfire. So his ministers tell him that your prince was riding on the streets, and as an accident, he happened to run over a calf, and so the cow has come asking for justice. The king is absolutely shattered. He says, I have for so many years run a kingdom flawlessly without having any injustice meted out, and it pains me to see that an innocent life has been so cruelly taken away. And the ministers advise him, saying that it was an accident, it was not an act of crime, because it was not done on purpose. And to atone for this sin, if you call it a sin, there are atonements or prayashchittas prescribed in the Vedas. So please hear the prescription of the Brahmins and do the prayashchitta, and you'll be cured of this papam. But Manunidhi Soran doesn't buy into that. He says, if I simply perform the atonement as the Brahmins prescribe, will that be a cure for the agony of the cow that has lost its tender calf by vile murder? If I listen to you to save my son's life, won't Dharma itself shudder at my actions? These are directly translated from the Peripuranam. And as soon as he says this, the ministers try advising him, but he doesn't listen. Finally, he passes his own verdict. He says, Idu tanaduru peridar yanum tanguvade karmam. I can't erase this cow's pain, but I too must suffer the same extreme grief that this innocent creature suffers. This is the law of karma. The king didn't even consider that this was the only son he had to continue his royal lineage. He in fact sent for his son and asked a minister to ride a chariot on the street that would run over the prince, to pass out the exact same justice that happened to the calf, so that he suffers the agony that the cow is now suffering. The minister, unable to execute such a cruel command, chooses to end his own life. Now, after this, the king himself takes the reins. He orders his son, who willingly obeys his father's command, just like Rama did, and lies down on the street. And finally, as the whole city watches, the king himself takes the chariot, rides, and runs over the chest of his own only son. Taken aback by this act of the king, the Lord, Veedi Vidanga, whom we call Thyagesa today, appears on his bull vehicle and gives darshan to this great soul. He brings the dead calf, the prince and the minister back to life, and blesses all these bhaktas who have unfalteringly stuck to the path of dharma even in the darkest times. So this is the story of Manunidhi Soran, which was very quickly given a brief run through in the Tiruppugal which I first sang. And this is the Mahima of the Manunidhi Soran, who Sekidar Peruman specifically says adds glory to Tiruvarur. And the second is that of a very different bhakta, who had a very different approach to Shiva Bhakti, which was Dandi-Adigal. In the very beginning, Sekidar Peruman says, Piranda Purudhe Kan Kanar. Dandi-Adigal was born without faculty of vision, but he had inner eye which always meditated upon the form of Lord Shiva. Again, Sekidar Peruman's words. And he grows up completely engrossed in Shiva Bhakti. Many years roll by, and he devotes his entire life to the service of Thyagesa. But at one point, when he has become an old blind man, there is a domination of the Shamana community in Tiruvarur. The Shamanas are a society of people whose main aim is to undermine and harm the practice of Shaivism at that time. And somehow they had won over the favor of the king, and at this juncture, they proceed to start filling in the Kamalalaya, sacred tank of the temple, with mud to close it up. Side note, Kamalalaya tank is one of the biggest tanks that we know of, and its glory is that throughout history, during times of drought, famine and so on, there is not a single instance when the Kamalalaya tank has dried up. And Kamalalaya is known to be a manifestation of Devi Parashakti herself, who is Kamalamba Devi in this temple. And the Shamanas, who wanted to harm the practice of Shaivism, proceeded to fill in the temple tank, the Kamalalaya, with mud to close it up. And nobody in the city of Tiruvarur dared oppose them, because they were too afraid of this community that had even won over the king's help. So nobody opposed them, but there was one man, the rebel, Dandi-Adigal, who said that, I know that I am an old, meek man who doesn't even have his eyesight, but when I see such an atrocity being committed, I can't stay silent. I must do my part to help this injustice be stopped. So how he starts to rebel against the Shamana is very interesting. So he can't even see what they're doing. So to find his way to oppose their actions, he drives some pegs into the ground to mark where to dig out mud. He fixes some sticks and runs a long rope to guide him from the Kamalalaya all the way to the outskirts. And using this rope, he feels his way and he digs up some mud in his basket, and goes along with the rope and deposits it in the outskirts of the temple and the city, only to return to the tank and repeat the same process all over again, all the while chanting the Shiva Nama. And he keeps doing this one basket at a time. He'll pick it up, slowly walk out, deposit it, come back. And the Shamanas are a huge community of people who are working together. So looking at this blind man and his efforts in vain, apparently, they start ridiculing him, mocking him, and laughing at him. And they call him a fool. They say that, you blind old man, you think you can possibly oppose such a strong group of people? And Thyagesa is unfazed. He in fact retorts and says, kan kurudai, yen kan ulagellam kanban, yan kandal yen sevir. Now that you ridicule me as a blind man, what will you do if I gain my vision and all of you lose your sight? What will you do then? And the Shamanas are even more amused. They say, if what you say really happens, we will leave this fertile town of Thiruvarur. But in the meanwhile, they're so amused and they're having so much fun mocking him that they pull out all his pegs and all the poles that he's constructed, snatch away his basket and push him away. Thyagesa is very saddened by the plight of things. He goes directly to Thyagesa, surrenders at his feet, and sleeps off that night. That very night, Thyagesa Peruman appears in Thyagesa dream and says, don't worry, for your bhakti, justice will be done and I will bless you. And he goes away. Thyagesa Peruman also appears in the dream of the king of Thiruvarur at the time and says, go talk to Thyagesa, who has been committed an injustice to, call him tomorrow and speak with him. The next morning, the king is absolutely, he has goosebumps at the Lord having given him darshan, and he calls Thyagesa to his court and inquires what has happened. Thyagesa narrates the entire incident from the previous day about how the Shamanas ill-treated him and mocked him, and he mentions very specifically that they have promised to leave the city if they all go blind and he regains his vision. So the king calls the Shamana community as well and verifies the facts. Finally, when he realizes that this is truly what happened, he takes all of them to the Kamalalaya tank, and there he requests Thyagesa to gain back his eyesight to show them the grace of Lord Shiva. And at this point, Thyagesa sings the following as per the Periya Puranam. He says, Yendadimai Shivanuk Yanenil Adimai Shivanuk Yanenil Indra en kan petru வேந்தனெதிரே திருவாரூர் விரவும் சமணர் கண்ணிழப்பர் ஆய்ந்த பொருளும் சிவபதமே ஆவதென்றே ஆய்ந்த பொருளும் சிவபதமேயாவதென்றே அஞ்செழுத்தை வாய்ந்த தொண்டர் அஞ்செழுத்தை வாய்ந்த தொண்டர் எடுத்து ஓதி மணி நீர் மூழ்கினார் So this is what the Sekira Peruman says about Thyagesa. He says that if I am a true devotee of Lord Shiva, then I will gain my eyesight today and they will all lose theirs, the Shamanas, before the eyes of the king. And believing that the Shiva and his feet are the only true supreme abode, I will chant the Panchakshara Mantram, Aindezhuthu, and dive into the tank of Kamalalaya. As soon as he goes into the tank, everyone is waiting with bated breath as to what will happen now. And Sekira Peruman says that also. He says, Torudu punal mel எழும் தொண்டர் தொழுது புனல் மேலெழும் தொண்டர் தூய மலர்கண் பெற்று எழுந்தார் தூய மலர்கள் பெற்று எழுந்தார் the devotee who went into the tank came out with shining flower-like eyes. And everyone is struck in wonder, especially the Shamanas. He said, Peruman says, Sekirar Peruman, Amanar viditte kannizhandu tadumara. They are wide-eyed in wonder, but by curse they are blinded. So there is no point of them being wide-eyed because they can't see anyway. And in that way, they lose their eyesight. And just as Dandiyadigal said, he regains his. And finally, the king realizes that the path of Shiva is that which is to be worshipped, and he falls at the feet of Dandiyadigal. And Dandiyadigal blesses him, and very happy with the grace of Thyagesa, continues his service to the mystic feet of Thyagesa until the end of his days on Bhuloka. And I mentioned his mystic feet because Dandiyadigal, when Sekira Peruman recites his Puranam, he says a line where he says, Malum Ayanum Ariyada Ponnam Kadalgal Potri. He has been praising the feet that were not even seen by Mal and Ayan, which means Brahma and Vishnu. This is a direct import from Appar or Thirunavukarasar's Thevaram, where he says, Disai Mukhanum Narayananum Terdum Kanadu Arura Arura engindrargal. During the Adi festival, the Vasantotsavam, where Thyagesa Peruman is brought on his chariot and in procession, Brahma and Vishnu came to see the feet of Thyagesa, but even they couldn't see it, and seeing the tracks of the chariot, they ran behind his chariot screaming his name for just a glimpse of his divine feet. Such is the greatness of the Bhaktas of Thiruvarur and Thyagesa Peruman himself. And this whole Tirutondar Puranam that we have today has been initiated by Thyagesa Peruman himself, because Sekirar Peruman wrote it on the basis of two preceding texts. One was Nambiyandar Nambi's Tirutondar Andadi, which was based on Sundaramurti Nayanar's Tirutondar Thokai. And the Tirutondar Thokai was written by Sundarar at the bidding of Thyagesa Peruman. So we see how much, as I said last time, Thyagesa Peruman loves to hear the glory of his bhaktas being sung. And to close off today's episode, I'd like to go back to something that I said in the very beginning of this whole series, in the introduction episode. And I'd like to say a few lines in Tamil to end today's episode. இன்னைக்கு இந்த முழு சீரீஸோட கடைசி பகுதி, அதனால முதல் பகுதியில் சொன்ன ஒரு விஷயத்தை சொல்லி நிறைவு செய்யணும் அப்படின்னு ஆசைப்படுறேன். முதல்ல திருவாரூர் க்ஷேத்திரத்தை பற்றி சொல்லின்னு வரைச்சேன். ஒரு ஸ்லோகம் சொன்னேன், ஜனநாத் கமலாலயே காஷ்யந்து மரணாம் முக்தி தர்ஷனாத் அப்ரசதசி ஸ்மரணாத் அருணாச்சலே அப்படின்னு. இதே தான் சுந்தரமூர்த்தி நாயனாரும் சொன்னாருன்னு சொன்னேன். திருவாரூர் பிறந்தார்கள் எல்லாருக்கும் அடியேன் அப்படின்னாரு. அதே விஷயத்த இங்கே தண்டியடிகள் புராணத்தை பார்த்ததுனால சொல்கிறேன். முதல் வரி இந்த புராணத்தில் சொல்கிறது சேக்கிழார் பெருமான், தண்டியடிகள் திருவாரூர் பிறக்கும் பெருமை தவமுடையார் அப்படிங்கிறாரு. திருவாரூர் பிறக்கும், திருவாரூரில் பிறக்கும் அப்படின்னு சொல்ல. ஜென்ரலாக திருவாரூர் பிறக்கும்னா தண்டியடிகள் ரொம்ப தவம் செஞ்சு இந்த திருவாரூர் க்ஷேத்திரத்தில் பிறந்தார் அப்படின்னு நம்ம நம்புவோம். ஆனால் இங்கே சேக்கிழார் பெருமானும் திருவாரூர் பிறக்கும் அப்படின்னு தான் சொல்லியிருக்காரு. அதே மாதிரி சுந்தரமூர்த்தி நாயனாரும் திருவாரூர் பிறந்தார்கள், திருவாரூரில் பிறந்தார்கள்னு சொல்ல. இதுக்கு என்ன தாத்பரியம்னு எனக்கு பெரியவாலாம் சொல்லி கேட்டதுலேருந்து எனக்கு என்ன சரின்னு தோன்றதுன்னா, திருவாரூரில் பிறப்பது மட்டும் முக்திக்கான மார்க்கம் அல்ல, திருவாரூர் என்ற உயர்ந்த தத்துவம் நமக்குள் பிறப்பதே முக்திக்கான மார்க்கம் அப்படின்னு தோன்றுறது. அதாவது திருவாரூர் அப்படிங்கிறது ஒரு இடமோ ஒரு க்ஷேத்திரம் மட்டும் இல்லை, அது ஒரு பெரிய தத்துவத்துக்கான ஒரு வெளிப்பாடு. இதை ஒரு அனுபவத்தில் தான் சொல்ல முடியுமே தவிர என்ன தத்துவம் அப்படின்னு எனக்காவது சொல்ல தெரியாது. ஆனால் இப்போ லாஸ்ட் ஒரு 5-6 வாரமாக இதை நம்ம அனுபவிச்சுன்னு வந்திருக்கோம். தியாகேஷ பெருமானும் திருவாரூரும் எவ்வளோ மகிமையுற்றது அண்ட் எவ்வளோ அத்வைத்தத்தின் பிரதிபாத்தியமாக இருக்குது, சங்கீதத்தோட யோகத்தோட பிரதிபாத்தியமாக இருக்குது அப்படின்லாம் பார்த்துன்னு வந்தோம். அப்பேற்பட்ட அந்த உயர்ந்த தத்துவம் நமக்குள்ளே பிறந்தா, நம்ம அது உணர்ந்தா அதுதான் முக்தியின் வழி. ஸ்மரணாத் அருணாச்சலேனா, எப்பவுமே ஒரு தரம் அருணாச்சலம் அப்படின்னு சொல்லிட்டா போகாது, ஒவ்வொரு வினாடியும் ஒவ்வொரு கணமும் சதா அதே ஸ்மரணையில் இருந்தால் அருணாச்சலம் முக்தியை நல்கும். தர்ஷனாத் அப்ரசதசி, சிதம்பரத்தை ஒரு தரம் மட்டும் பார்த்தால் போராது, நம் அகக்கண்ணால் நம்முள் சிதம்பரத்தை உணர வேண்டும். காஷ்யந்து மரணா முக்தி, நாம் எனும் அகந்தையை காசியில் துளைத்தால் அது மரணத்துக்கு சமானம், அது முக்தி நல்கும். அதே மாதிரி ஜனநாத் கமலாலி, திருவாரூர் என்றும் உயர்ந்த தத்துவம் நம்முள் பிறந்தால் அதுவே முக்திக்கான மார்க்கம் அப்படின்னு சொல்லி இந்த பகுதியை நான் நிறைவு செய்ய விரும்புகிறேன். இந்த முழு சீரீஸோட கடைசி பகுதி இது. ஸோ உங்கள் எல்லாருக்கும் என் நன்றியை தெரிவிச்சுண்டு Thank you all for joining me on this journey. And it has been a true blessing of mine to be able to share all this with you. And I hope you also have benefited and have enjoyed this series. So on that note, hoping that Thyagesa's divine feet, his Rahasya Tirumeni, will forever guide us and guide us back to his lotus feet, I would like to complete this series. Srimad Tyagarajo Virajate, Shri Gurubhyo Namaha.